I joked about having a threesome with my boyfriend and his brother during dinner with his family. When I woke up the next morning, both of them were gone, and I was lying alone in a hotel room with a note that said, "Thanks for the suggestion." What had seemed like harmless flirting during an awkward family dinner had somehow turned into the most humiliating experience of my life. I thought I was being playful, maybe a little edgy to lighten the mood at what was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, I'd apparently given my boyfriend Jake and his older brother Ryan exactly the excuse they needed to destroy everything I thought we'd built together over the past 2 years. I thought it was just dirty talk that got out of hand, but apparently my boyfriend Jake had been planning something like this for months. The morning light streaming through the hotel room curtains felt harsh and unforgiving as I tried to piece together what had happened the night before. The silence in the room was deafening. No sound of running water from the bathroom, no quiet breathing from the other side of the bed, no signs of life anywhere. That's when I saw the note on the nightstand, written in Jake's familiar handwriting on hotel stationery. The words were simple but devastating. "Thanks for the suggestion. Don't contact us again. J and R." Below the note was a small stack of $20 bills, like payment for services rendered. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. I grabbed my phone from the floor where it had apparently been dropped, my hands shaking as I tried to call Jake. The call went straight to a generic voicemail message. He'd blocked my number. Ryan's number did the same thing. In the span of one evening, I'd gone from being in a committed relationship with a man I thought I might marry to being completely cut off from him and his entire family. What I discovered when I got home made me realize this wasn't just a drunken mistake. It was calculated revenge. My name is Emma, and before that disastrous night, I thought I had my life figured out. I'd been dating Jake Morrison for almost 2 years, ever since we'd met at the marketing firm, where I worked as an account coordinator, and he'd been brought in to update our computer systems. Jake was quiet, thoughtful, and refreshingly stable after a string of relationships with guys who'd been exciting but ultimately unreliable. The relationship had progressed steadily and comfortably. We'd moved in together after 8 months, splitting the rent on a nice apartment downtown. We talked about marriage, about buying a house, about all the milestones that serious couples discuss. Everything felt like it was moving in the right direction. But there had always been one source of tension in our relationship: Jake's older brother, Ryan. Ryan Morrison was everything Jake wasn't. Confident, successful, commanding attention the moment he walked into any room. At 26, he was already a partner at a prestigious law firm, drove a luxury car, and lived in a penthouse apartment that probably cost more per month than Jake and I made combined. He was also devastatingly handsome in a way that made people do double takes on the street. The Morrison family dynamics were complicated, built around Ryan's achievements and Jake's position as the younger brother who never quite measured up. Their parents clearly favored Ryan, constantly talking about his latest professional victories and asking Jake when he was going to find more ambition. Family gatherings often felt like showcases for Ryan's success, with Jake relegated to the role of supportive younger sibling. I'd always felt uncomfortable around Ryan, not because he was unkind, but because his presence seemed to highlight everything Jake wasn't. Where Jake was quiet and thoughtful, Ryan was bold and decisive. Where Jake was content with his modest IT job, Ryan was constantly climbing higher in his career. Where Jake was careful with money, Ryan spent freely on expensive clothes and gadgets. But what made me most uncomfortable was the way Ryan looked at me sometimes, like he was evaluating something. It wasn't overtly inappropriate, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made me feel exposed and judged. Jake never seemed to notice these looks, or if he did, he never mentioned them. I thought my jokes about his brother were just harmless teasing, but I didn't realize Jake had been building a case against me for months. The jokes had started small. Little comments about how lucky I was to be dating into such a successful family, or teasing Jake about being the other Morrison brother. Jake had always laughed at these comments, telling me later that he thought my irreverent sense of humor was refreshing in his otherwise formal family environment. But as our relationship progressed and the pressure to fit in with his family increased, my jokes had become more pointed, more boundary-pushing. I'd make comments about Ryan's dating life, about the attention he got from women, about how different the two brothers were. I told myself I was just being playful, that everyone understood I was joking, but I can see now that I was playing with fire. Jake had been growing more distant in the months before the dinner, something I'd attributed to stress at work and the pressure of planning our future together. Our physical relationship had become routine, our conversations had grown repetitive, and I'd started to feel like we were more like roommates than romantic partners. I'd been trying to inject some excitement back into our relationship, to be more spontaneous and adventurous. I'd suggested date nights at new restaurants, weekend trips to places we'd never been, activities that might help us reconnect. Jake had gone along with these suggestions, but without much enthusiasm. What I didn't realize was that Jake had been documenting my behavior, screenshotting text messages where I'd made jokes about his family, keeping track of comments I'd made at gatherings. He'd been building a case that I was disrespectful, inappropriate, and ultimately unworthy of being part of the Morrison family. The family dinner that changed everything was supposed to be a celebration of his parents' 30th wedding anniversary. They'd chosen an upscale restaurant in the city, the kind of place where everyone spoke in hushed tones, and the wine list cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I'd spent hours getting ready, choosing a dress that was elegant but not too revealing, trying to strike the perfect balance between fitting in and maintaining my own style. From the moment we sat down, I could feel the familiar tension that always accompanied Morrison family gatherings. Jake's father dominated the conversation with stories from his real estate business, while his mother asked pointed questions about our future plans that always made me feel like I was being interviewed for a position I wasn't sure I wanted. Ryan arrived late, as he often did, making an entrance that drew attention from other diners in the restaurant. He was wearing an expensive suit that fit him perfectly, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. He kissed his mother's cheek, shook his father's hand, and clapped Jake on the shoulder before taking his seat across from me. The conversation naturally shifted to Ryan's latest career achievements. A high-profile case he'd won, a promotion he was being considered for, a networking event where he'd made important connections. Jake grew quieter as Ryan talked, his smile becoming more forced with each story of his brother's success. I started drinking wine earlier than I normally would have, trying to calm my nerves and ease the discomfort I always felt at these family events. The alcohol made me feel bolder, more willing to inject some levity into what felt like a very serious and self-important conversation. That's when I made the first comment that would ultimately destroy my relationship. Ryan was telling a story about a female colleague who'd been flirting with him at the office, and I found myself saying something about how he must have women throwing themselves at him all the time. I meant it as a light compliment, a way to acknowledge his obvious attractiveness without making it weird, but I could see Jake tense up beside me. Instead of changing the subject, I doubled down, making a joke about how I'd hit the brother lottery by ending up with Jake when someone as eligible as Ryan was sitting right there at the same table. The comment was supposed to be flattering to both of them, acknowledging Ryan's desirability while making it clear that I'd chosen Jake. But Jake didn't smile. His parents looked uncomfortable, and Ryan just stared at me with that intense look I'd noticed before, like he was filing away everything I said for future reference. The wine kept flowing, and my comments kept escalating. I made jokes about keeping it in the family, about how genetics had clearly been kind to both Morrison brothers, about how I could see the family resemblance in all the right ways. Each comment was meant to be playful, a way to lighten the mood and show that I was comfortable enough with everyone to joke around. The final comment that sealed my fate came when Ryan mentioned that he was having trouble finding someone to settle down with, someone who could handle his demanding career and social obligations. Without thinking, emboldened by alcohol and misreading the room completely, I laughed and said maybe he should just share with Jake, that I could probably handle both Morrison brothers if they were interested. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's face went white, then red, then white again. His parents looked like they'd been slapped. Ryan just smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was calculating, predatory, like he'd just been handed exactly what he'd been waiting for. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of ending the evening in awkward embarrassment, Jake suggested we all go to the hotel bar to continue the conversation. He said we should talk more privately about what I'd just suggested, that maybe we needed to explore what I really meant by those comments. I thought Jake was being spontaneous and adventurous, maybe finally ready to inject some excitement into our relationship. The alcohol had made me bold, and I was ready for whatever Jake had in mind. When he suggested getting a hotel room to continue our discussion, I assumed he was planning some kind of romantic surprise. Ryan surprisingly agreed to join us, saying he was interested in hearing more about my thoughts on the Morrison family dynamic. I should have recognized the warning signs in his tone, the way both brothers seemed to be communicating without words, but I was too intoxicated and too focused on what I thought was finally happening. Jake taking charge and being spontaneous. I should have recognized that this was dangerous territory, that I was being led somewhere I didn't want to go. But the attention from both brothers was intoxicating in a way I'd never experienced before. For the first time since I'd known the Morrison family, I felt like I was the center of attention instead of an uncomfortable outsider trying to fit in. Jake kept asking leading questions, encouraging me to be more explicit about my attraction to Ryan, to elaborate on my jokes about sharing between brothers. Ryan sat quietly, watching me with those intense eyes, occasionally smiling in a way that made me feel like I was performing for his entertainment. When Jake suggested we get a room to continue our conversation in private, I agreed without hesitation. I thought this was the adventure I'd been hoping for, the spontaneity that had been missing from our relationship. Even when Ryan said he'd join us, I didn't question the appropriateness of the situation. What happened next is still partly a blur in my memory, clouded by alcohol and the surreal nature of the situation. I remember Jake encouraging me to show Ryan what I'd been talking about, to prove that I meant what I'd said at dinner. I remember feeling like I was in some kind of dream, like this couldn't possibly be real life. I remember Ryan watching everything with clinical detachment, like he was observing an experiment rather than participating in it. I remember Jake's voice, usually so gentle and reassuring, taking on a harder edge as he directed the situation. And I remember at some point realizing that this wasn't the romantic adventure I'd thought it was, but by then it was too late to stop what was happening. When I woke up the next morning, both brothers were gone. The room was eerily quiet, and sunlight was streaming through the curtains I didn't remember closing. I was alone in the bed, with no memory of how the evening had ended or when Jake and Ryan had left. The note on the nightstand made everything clear. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision born from too much wine and poor judgment. This had been planned, orchestrated, designed to teach me a lesson about the consequences of my inappropriate comments and behavior. The money left beside the note was the final insult, transforming what I'd thought was an intimate encounter between people who cared about each other into something transactional and degrading. I understood the message. They saw me as someone who could be bought, used and discarded when they were finished with me. When I finally made it home later that morning, calling my roommate to pick me up because I was too shaken to drive, I discovered that Jake had already been to our apartment. He'd taken his belongings, clothes, books, electronics, anything that belonged to him, and left behind only the things that were clearly mine. But what hurt most was discovering that he'd also taken items we'd bought together, things that represented our shared life and future plans. The coffee maker we'd chosen together for our first apartment, the framed photos from vacations we'd taken, the books we'd read and discussed, all gone, as if our relationship had never existed. The worst part wasn't losing Jake, it was discovering how long he'd been planning to destroy me. Over the next few days, as I tried to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward, I made a devastating discovery. While cleaning out some old files on a laptop we'd shared, I found a folder, labeled with my name, that contained screenshots of text messages I'd sent, photos from social media posts, and detailed notes about things I'd said and done over the past several months. Jake had been documenting my behavior systematically, building a case against me that painted a picture of someone who was inappropriate, disrespectful, and obsessed with his brother. Comments I'd made jokingly were presented without context, making them seem predatory and calculated. Photos where I happened to be standing near Ryan at family gatherings were saved as evidence of my inappropriate interest in him. The folder also contained text message exchanges between Jake and Ryan, planning what they called teaching Emma a lesson. They'd discussed my behavior at length, analyzing my comments and jokes for evidence of what they saw as my true intentions. The dinner that night hadn't been coincidental. They'd chosen that setting specifically because they knew I'd be nervous and likely to make inappropriate comments. Even more damaging was discovering that Jake had shared some of this evidence with his family and friends, painting me as someone who'd been pursuing Ryan and disrespecting their relationship from the beginning. He'd created a narrative where he was the long-suffering boyfriend trying to make things work with a girlfriend who was obviously interested in someone else. The brothers hadn't just taken advantage of me. They'd orchestrated the entire situation to justify what they'd already decided to do. My inappropriate jokes had given them the excuse they needed, but the plan to humiliate and discard me had been in the works for much longer than I'd realized. The immediate aftermath was devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Within days of that night, everyone in our shared social circle seemed to know what had happened, though the version they'd heard painted me as the instigator who'd gotten exactly what I'd asked for. Friends who'd known us as a couple were suddenly distant and judgmental, making it clear that they'd chosen Jake's side in whatever story he'd told them. My professional life began to crumble almost immediately. Both Jake and Ryan had connections throughout the business community in our city, and word of my inappropriate behavior spread quickly through professional networks. Clients began requesting different account managers for their projects, colleagues avoided me in meetings, and my supervisor called me in for increasingly uncomfortable conversations about my conduct. The culmination came when HR informed me that several complaints had been filed about my behavior at company social events, citing inappropriate comments and unprofessional conduct. The specific incidents they mentioned were all situations where I'd made jokes or comments that had seemed harmless at the time, but when presented without context, painted a picture of someone with serious judgment issues. I tried to defend myself, to explain that my comments had been taken out of context and that my personal life had nothing to do with my professional performance. But the damage was already done. The company suggested I take a leave of absence to address my personal issues, which we all understood was a polite way of asking me to resign. Within a month of that disastrous dinner, I'd lost my job, my apartment, and most of my social circle. The few friends who remained were sympathetic but distant, clearly uncomfortable with being associated with someone who'd become the subject of so much gossip and speculation. My family's reaction was perhaps the most painful part of the entire ordeal. When I tried to explain what had happened, focusing on how I'd been manipulated and set up, they listened with increasing skepticism and disapproval. My traditional parents had always liked Jake, seeing him as a stabilizing influence on their daughter, who they'd always worried was too impulsive and outspoken. My sister was more supportive initially, but even she eventually admitted that she couldn't understand why I'd made such poor choices. She pointed out that everyone knew Jake's family was conservative and traditional, and that my jokes about his brother had been inappropriate regardless of how they'd responded to them. Even my living situation became untenable. Jake and I had signed a joint lease on our apartment, but with my job gone and my reputation in tatters, I couldn't afford to maintain the place on my own. Jake had no intention of helping with the remaining rent, and I couldn't legally force him to pay his share when he was no longer living there. I was forced to break the lease early, paying substantial penalties that wiped out most of my savings. Finding a new place was challenging with my damaged employment history and lack of references, eventually settling for a studio apartment in a less desirable part of town that I could barely afford. The financial implications were staggering. In addition to the lease penalties and moving costs, I was facing the prospect of extended unemployment in a job market where my professional reputation had been severely damaged. The legal costs of trying to understand what had happened that night, including consultations with attorneys about whether I had any recourse, ate through what little money I had left. But the hardest part was accepting that while I'd been manipulated and set up, I'd also made choices that had made their plan possible. My inappropriate comments about Ryan hadn't been entirely innocent. There had been some attraction there, some awareness of his appeal that had made my jokes feel dangerous and exciting. I'd also been drinking too much that night, making decisions with impaired judgment that I might not have made sober. While that didn't excuse what Jake and Ryan had done to me, it did mean I had to accept some responsibility for putting myself in a vulnerable position. The brothers hadn't just taken advantage of me. They'd used my own weaknesses and poor judgment against me in a way that was both calculated and cruel. They'd identified my tendency to make inappropriate jokes when nervous, my attraction to attention and drama, and my desire to fit in with Jake's family, then created a situation designed to exploit all of those vulnerabilities. As the months passed, I began to piece together a clearer picture of what had really happened that night and in the months leading up to it. The evidence I'd found on Jake's laptop revealed a pattern of manipulation that went back almost to the beginning of our relationship. Jake had never been as secure in our relationship as he'd appeared. The jokes I'd made about Ryan hadn't been harmless teasing to him. They'd been confirmation of his worst fears about not being good enough, about losing to his brother once again. Instead of talking to me about his insecurities, he'd chosen to document them as evidence of my disloyalty. Ryan's role in the situation was perhaps even more troubling. The text messages between the brothers revealed that he'd been encouraging Jake's suspicions about me, suggesting that my comments were evidence of deeper, inappropriate desires. He'd positioned himself as the protective older brother, helping Jake see the truth about his manipulative girlfriend. But there were also hints in their communications that Ryan had his own motivations for wanting to destroy my relationship with Jake. References to me being too good for him and suggestions that I was wasted on someone with Jake's limited ambitions suggested that Ryan saw me as something his brother didn't deserve to have. The hotel incident hadn't been spontaneous revenge for my dinner comments. It had been the culmination of a longer campaign to prove that I was the person they'd decided I was. They'd created a situation where my worst impulses would be revealed and documented, providing them with the justification they needed to discard me completely. Even casual friendships were difficult to maintain. I found myself second-guessing every comment I made, worried that my tendency toward inappropriate humor would once again get me into trouble. The spontaneity and boldness that had once been part of my personality felt dangerous now, like weapons that could be turned against me. I'd learned that some jokes aren't funny, especially when they reveal truths that people aren't ready to hear. My comments about Ryan hadn't been entirely innocent. There had been attraction there, an awareness that I was playing with fire by acknowledging it publicly. But the punishment had far exceeded the crime, destroying my life in ways that seemed disproportionate to my poor judgment. The experience had taught me about the difference between playful banter and dangerous games, about the importance of reading situations correctly before opening my mouth. But it had also taught me about how people could use your worst moments against you, how calculated cruelty could masquerade as justified consequences. I'd also learned that some people are willing to destroy others to protect their own sense of superiority and control. Jake's willingness to systematically document my behavior and plan my humiliation revealed a side of him I'd never suspected existed. Ryan's participation in the scheme showed how family loyalty could be twisted into something toxic and manipulative. The brothers had used my inappropriate behavior to justify their cruel response, but their actions revealed character flaws far worse than anything I'd done. My jokes had been thoughtless and boundary-crossing, but their response had been calculated, cruel, and designed to cause maximum damage to my life and reputation. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And I'm curious, what city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever made a joke that completely backfired and changed your life? Sometimes our attempts at being funny or edgy can have consequences we never saw coming. Share your thoughts about where the line should be drawn between harmless flirting and dangerous games, and I'll see you in the next story.